Hello and welcome. This is a bonus episode following up on our October 19th, 2022 webinar on Reserve Studies Q&A. We had an open session, a very popular session, just answering questions that the audience had. And we had so many questions, we wanted to provide this bonus content answering all the questions that we didn't have time to answer online. So this is going to be a time where I answer reserve component questions. We'll have some other complementary sessions on general questions, funding plan, insurance, investment, inflation, legislation, and miscellaneous questions. So we'll get to those in another session, but let me just spend a few minutes here talking about components. So first one, how do we stay up to date on key requirements for associations that require action and potential expenditures we need to plan for? Recent examples are fire alarm upgrades and balcony inspections. Answer is regularly update your reserve study. Use a credentialed reserve study provider, someone who knows industry standards. A credentialed provider is someone with an RS or PRA behind their names. That stands for Reserve Specialist or Professional Reserve Analyst. And also plug into a local community association trade organization. Those are going to be great ways to know what the latest information is, the latest requirements are for properties in your area. I guess a third way would be professional management. Lean on them. They often know or are a great resource for requirements because they apply that to all the associations they manage. We have potentially $30,000 in new waistline expenditures within the next 12 months. We don't think we want to add it to our reserve study, but we do think we need to set funds aside. How would you organize this? Well, of course, discuss with your reserve study provider. If it is an upcoming expense, you want to be prepared. And if you know about it, basically tag, it's on you now. You have a responsibility as a board member to be prepared or to prepare the association. What you need to fear is not higher assessments. What you need to fear is an inability to care for the property. And remember that the expenses are going to happen one way or another. Your only choice is if you handle the expense with reserves on an ongoing basis or if you handle the expense on a special assessment. Either way, the homeowners pay the same amount. So you're not really raising the homeowners' costs. All you're doing is spreading it out on the monthly basis so they know exactly how much it costs to live there at the association. Our association is responsible for water and sewer pipes, but they are not accessible to quantify or inspect, so that makes them inappropriate for reserve funding. Well, that's, I guess, in your judgment. Repairs and partial replacements should be treated as a maintenance expense. Okay, that's your opinion. Significant failure will likely require an emergency special assessment. Again, your opinion. History, they were installed in 2009, a unit just sold, and an inspection was found, an unexpected problem in the sewer line that will cost us $7,000 to fix. Okay, one fix cost them $7,000 back in 2009, 13 years ago. We have no line item for this in operating or reserves. That's a problem. We are a co-housing 55 and over community with low-income residents who can't afford a special assessment. Okay, if you can't afford a special assessment, you better start preparing now. Can we postpone some repairs that are budgeted and use reserve funds? Well, discuss with your reserve study provider and create reserve funds exactly for this. The house is going to cost what it costs. Again, the reserve funding does not dictate, or actually the reserve study does not dictate the expenses. The expenses are dictated by the building itself. The roofing, the asphalt, the painting, the plumbing in this case will fail. It's up to you as a board member to identify those, hire a reserve study provider to help you identify those, and prepare for them. Just ignoring an expense isn't going to make it go away, or crossing your fingers and wishing that they go away won't help. It is what it is. So I'm sorry that you're a 55 and over community association with low-income residents who, in your definition, can't afford a special assessment, but the cost is what it is. So now that we have history repairs, can we add sewer inspection and repair to our next reserve study? Absolutely. Do that. Generally, a reserve specialist is not equipped to inspect plumbing lines, so you'll need a plumbing expert to help you with that. That plumbing expert can then inform the reserve study provider, who can help you with your budget and cash flow plan. But yeah, don't fear higher expenses. Fear being unprepared, and fear having property values go down by thousands and thousands and thousands. Your job as a board member is to maintain the property, not keep assessments low. Oh, and by the way, remember that postponing major expenses often makes them more expensive. So you end up shooting yourself in the foot. Okay, we have a line item called plumbing, drainage, and sewer contingency. We have 18 units. And the current cost for that budget line item is $1,000 per unit. Start date of 2002, useful life of 20 years, remaining life of 0. Okay, I get it. So $18,000, 20-year useful life, remaining useful life of 0. We had to repair at one unit several years ago for $700. But now that we're at a remaining useful life of 0, do we just extend the useful life and remaining useful life and basically keep adding to the fully funded reserves already accumulated? And the answer is no guessing. It's not your job as a board member to guess. Your job as a board member is to decide what the association needs. And what you need is updated information. You can't be basing your budget planning on 20-year-old information. And that one little $700 data point from several years ago. So retain a plumber to give you a good estimate for condition of your plumbing. That will inform the reserve study provider and help you update your reserve study so you know exactly what you're getting into and how to prepare. Okay, we have a line item, an allowance for concrete walkway repairs. Current cost $4,000, useful life of 10 years. Got it. Okay, the remaining useful life is now 0. We spent $3,000 in 2021 and $4,000 in 2022. Should we update the line item again for another 10 years and change the cost to $7,000 and restart the start date or life cycle? And that's hard to answer. My recommendation is discuss with your reserve study provider. Make sure you're doing an update with site visit so you can get a good eyes on the situation. It may mean that based on $3,000 last year, $4,000 earlier this year, you need to change perhaps both the cost and the frequency of that allowance. So check with your reserve study provider. I would like to see a full list of all the reserve, all the possible reserve components. How would I know if something is missing that should be included? For example, our managing agent has repeatedly not included pipe replacement when he does a reserve planning. I have a lot of thoughts on that. Number one, your managing agent is not a reserve specialist. Your managing agent has no independence. Your managing agent has no expertise. And your managing agent, because they have no independence, has a motive to keep your budget very friendly and not raise it to a point that might bother you and potentially lose the management contract. So that's not a smart way to get your reserve study done. You need independence and you need expertise. So regarding that, the answer, the components don't come from a list. They come from the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test. So it's not a master list where something could appear or not. It's a 4-part test. It needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, needs to have a life limit, needs to have a predictable remaining useful life, and above a minimum threshold cost of significance. That's what you look at when you're looking around the property. How about that asset? How about that asset? You need to think 4-part test. That's the lens that you look at things through as you are considering what is appropriate to fund through reserves. It's not a master list that you look and see if it's on the list. Can reserve funds be used for capital improvement projects? Quick answer, no. Reserve funds were set aside for the repair or replacement of existing assets. They effectively are already designated towards something. The roof is going to fail, the paint is going to fail, the fence is going to fall down, the carpet. If you spend those reserve funds that were collected purposefully for something that was not designed for them to be used for, like a new something, then you're just depleting a reserve fund and making it less likely that you have the funds that you need to do those reserve projects when it comes time for them to be done. So no, no spending reserves for capital improvements. Why does it seem that reserve studies underestimate the cost of a common replacement? Well, number one, I'm sorry to hear you have that stereotype, but the truth is the most common reason is that either the reserve study was done not by a credentialed preparer, maybe like the manager in the prior question. What you need to look for is someone with a RS or PRA behind their name. The second major reason is they're looking at a dated reserve study. Just think of it. 3 years ago, we didn't have a pandemic. We didn't have a supply chain problem. We didn't have the high inflation that we have right now. So a reserve study, even from 3 years ago, is going to be way off base. So you need to regularly update your reserve study annually as recommended. Best practice is a with-site visit every third year with annual adjustments in between. So if your reserve study was prepared by someone that was not credentialed or more than a year ago, it's likely out of date and the numbers are going to be off base. We have an aging marina and are concerned about replacement costs. What data source is your firm using when establishing replacement costs in our reserve study? Well, as a budget and cash flow specialist, we are not particular experts in any one of 100 different areas of specialties. We go to experts in the field. So we're likely going to interview the company that does your dredging, the company that does your docks and gangways, maybe your waterfront, your bulkhead. So, or the boat ramp, all those kinds of things. We're going to interview those people, find out what are the local costs, what are they finding out, what do they know of your material, what do they know about usage factors. That's what we do as a reserve study provider. We assemble, we gather that information and crank it into a reserve study. So it's not one magic national resource list. We are assemblers, we're very good assemblers of information. Are e-car charging stations at an association a homeowner cost? Let me change that to something I can answer. The installation of new electronic automobile charging stations is a capital improvement. Therefore, it's not a good use of reserve funds. Once it's installed, either with excess operating funds or with a special assessment or outside funds, once it's installed at your association, then by all means, make sure they're incorporated in your reserve study next time around so the repair or replacement can be budgeted in your reserve study. We have a riprap area that needs repair. Riprap are those large stones, large boulders adjacent to a body of water or flowing water that protect the shoreline. It is part of a stormwater system for the whole community. Is this paid for, I'm guessing repairs, paid for from general reserve, the reserve fund for the location of the riprap, or the daily operating funds? I don't know how your association is organized into multiple cost centers, but classically the funds should be collected and paid for by the entity responsible for its maintenance. So check with your reserve study provider. There may be some nuances in your governing documents, but on the basis of your question, I don't understand the difference between general reserves and location of the riprap, but that sounds like something that would pass the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test, at least for periodic repairs to the riprap. If boundary walls are not included in the reserve study due to not knowing the useful life, how do you pay for the replacement? Well, that's true. Generally, things like boundary walls don't all fail in the same year after 20 years or 40 years. So they don't need to be replaced all at once. So typically what we do is an allowance for major repairs. And so we look at the boundary walls, we look at how they've been behaving, if they're starting to crack, if you're getting local failures, we'll ask about any repair or replacement experience that you've had at the association, and we'll design an allowance line item for X $1,000 of repairs every Y years to keep the asset intact. It's very unlikely we'll have one budget line item to replace the whole 2,000 lineal feet or 10,000 lineal feet of boundary walls. In computing the variable component, which sheet should be used to pull off those components? Accounting and tax? And I'm going to have to say, sorry, I don't understand the question. That sounds like you are asking, don't know what numbers you're talking about and what documents you're asking about. Next, if you add a new capital item to your property that you didn't have previously, like a fence, gate, or security camera, not previously provided in your reserve study, how was this handled? Well, you add the asset through a special assessment, again, or excess operating funds. Then once it is added, then you add it to the reserve study, and so you then begin planning for its next eventual repair or replacement. But don't spend reserves on capital improvements. What decision tree is best to distinguish operating expenses for vehicles or machinery versus reserve expenses for those same assets? Well, pretty simply, if it's leased, it's an operating expense. And then you look at it with the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test. So generally, you can use that test, and quite commonly, trucks, vans, security runabout cars, utility carts, golf carts, mowers, big maintenance equipment, things like that. Quite typically, those qualify as reserve expenses. So if you own them and they're common area maintenance, they're life limited with a predictable remaining useful life and above a minimum threshold cost. I guess one of the oddest ones I ever saw was a water spray vehicle, big tanker truck, big diesel tanker truck that they use to drive around the perimeter of their association during fire time of year. So we will look at the asset, we'll look at its age, we'll look at how it's used, and we'll design either a repair or replacement line item for that asset. Okay, there's been a long debate at our association about only including real property versus personal property. Items like vehicles and other items are funded out of operations. Do you have a recommendation, rule, or best practice, or a different type for each different type of community? Well, this is a technical accounting question. IRS defines real property differently than personal property. Roughly speaking, real property is something that's fixed to the ground. Personal property is something that moves around. Could be a truck, okay? So the answer is, when you're preparing a reserve study, use National Reserve Study standards. Don't worry about IRS standards when you're doing reserve planning. So if it passes the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test, it's a reserve component, even if it, by IRS standards, is personal property. Is there anything in the law or elsewhere to prevent an association from using reserve funds for other purposes other than the ones for which the funds were accumulated in reserve? Most significantly, for a lawsuit, for instance. Okay, so we're talking about using reserves for a non-reserve project. We're not talking about using reserves that you thought were going to be for the roof for another reserve project like asphalt. We're not talking about that. We're talking about non-reserve project. Either a lawsuit the board might be tempted to file against a homeowner, sounds like a friendly place, or to defend from a lawsuit filed against the homeowner. I wonder if it's by the same homeowner. Okay, what about taking the money from the reserve to pay off a loan, for instance? Okay, so we're talking about reserves for non-reserve projects. Same thing. Reserves were collected from homeowners for a dedicated purpose, to repair and replace the assets of the corporation and maintain the property in a livable, enjoyable way that maximizes property values. If you use reserves for any other purpose, in many states there are requirements that you have to then restore those reserves back to the reserve fund in a matter of months, a specified number of months. And if you use reserves for non-reserve projects, it's at least a matter of fiscal responsibility. Reserves, again, were collected for a purpose, so don't spend them for non-reserve purposes. They were collected, you could say, tax exempt. They are not profit held from year to year, and so they need to be used for reserve projects and reserve projects alone. So if you use it for something else, make sure you restore those funds to reserves within a very specified short number of months. Typically, it's 12 or 24, something like that. Okay, we often debate whether minor costs should be paid from reserves versus the annual operating budget, which always seems to be limited. Hey, everything's limited. Don't fool yourself. Reserves are as limited or more than the operating account. I've heard that a cost should be greater than 1% of the operating budget before using reserve funds. Is that a valid guidance, or can it be lower? Okay, in defining your reserve components, typically the threshold, that test number 4, is it above a minimum threshold cost of significance, ends up being about 0.5% to 1% of the association's annual budget. That's a rough estimate. That depends on the size of the association's annual budget, whether it's extremely huge, extremely small, or somewhere in the middle normal range. Depends on the manager's signature authority, the board member's signature authority. Basically, you don't want to be spending reserves on something trivial. You don't want to be amassing the board and making a resolution to spend something, repair something simple, $250 for a little pool pump. That's ridiculous. You should be just telling the pool service company, fix it, and move on with your life. So discuss that with your reserves aid provider. See what's appropriate at your association. They will provide you some wise counsel. Can a board member request for line items in reserves aid to be removed? We had $32,000 in drought tolerance landscaping. Good for you. Sounds like they were going to replace their grass with something else. And then it dropped off after the previous president took it off. And now we can't get it back on a reserves day because the reserves day company refuses to work with our HOA, saying the board was difficult to work with. There are associations like that. And yeah, you can get a reputation of being difficult to work with, and someone can say, sorry, it's not worth our time and energy. Remember that the reserves day is the work product of the credentialed professional. We know when to dig our heels in. It's our logo on the cover. So if someone says, please take this out, we will say, sorry, no, it's in. We have to honor our professional credentials. You asked for our opinion, and it is our opinion that it is in. So it was a little bit of a problem with this last reserves day provider to get pushed around. And yeah, I can understand that kind of a reserves day provider saying it's not worth their time to work with your association again. And I'm sorry to hear that. So it's time for you to get a new reserves day provider and start over and start taking their wise counsel and not trying to push them around. I have a question about a particular reserve component. Every 2 years, we pay to clean out the dryer vents and want to add it to and pay it out of reserves. Sounds good. One person thinks it doesn't qualify, but it is more than 1% of our annual budget. I wonder if I said something in the reserve study or in the webinar. And it's hard to manage from the operational budget. Well, that's exactly the purpose of the reserve study, to give you a tool to manage these expenses, especially the multi-year expenses that are large and significant. So yes, dryer vent cleaning. Wow, I have no idea what the IRS would say on that. But as far as the reserve study standards, it's common area maintenance responsibility. It's life limited. You know it's every 2 years. You know it's going to occur. You know you can see it coming because you can see how long it was from the last time. And it's a significant cost to your association. It's above 1% of your annual budget. So yeah, it sounds like a great thing to be a reserve component at your association. The community is exploring xeriscaping. That's low water planting. The rough plan is around $100,000. There's nothing like this in the reserves. Please comment on the process you would recommend to add this to the capital plan and reserves. Community approval, phase expenses. Talk to your reserve study provider. They may be able to slip it in as an upcoming reserve project. It does sound like, as I said, landscape projects do commonly pass the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test. You're going to hear that so much. That's the way we think. Talk to your reserve study provider, get it added into your reserve study, get preparing for it with as much time as you have. Use time to your advantage to prepare. Don't let it hit you like a slap in the face. Don't be surprised by it. but talk to your reserve study provider and get it added into your reserve study. Okay, in best practices, step 3 is spend as recommended. Good for you to understand that. Best practice is update your reserve study, collect reserves as recommended, spend reserves as recommended, and get a periodic infrastructure report. So, spend as recommended. And let's use carpeting as an example. What if the existing is not suffering wear and tear according to carpet experts? I wonder who they have on their board that is a self-proclaimed carpet expert. Without a majority of owners clamoring for new carpet, what response to the minority who just want a new design? Well, I have to remind you that something doesn't have to physically deteriorate before it's considered failed. There is aesthetic failure, there's technological failure, there's other types of failure around your association. There's 5 types of failure, and of course I'm not remembering them all right now, but aesthetic failure is one of them. You don't want a perfectly good community room or clubhouse that is 20 years old that looks like it. That's no longer an attractive asset at your association. So that's just an example that aesthetic age can bring something to failure. So aesthetic failure is one of the 5 failure modes, and I'll probably remember all 5 of them right after I stop recording. Our documents state that projects costing 20% or less of the annual general budget have to be okayed by 51% of the section of ownership that the expenditure affects. Boy, that's a messy set of governing documents. Can additional parking spaces be built as per engineer's report using the reserve funds for that town hall section? That's too complicated of a question for me to answer in a free webinar Q&A. You're going to need to discuss that project with your attorney and your reserve study professional. That's exactly the kind of information that you're going to need specific to your association. We already reserve project management fees for reserve projects. What about preliminary project development fees, design plans, contracts, etc.? Is it appropriate to reserve an allowance for these fees also? The answer is yes. Basically, as my mom would say, soup to nuts, the whole thing. You should budget for the entire cost of the project. That means project development, specs, planning, shipping, storage, permits, doing the work, cleanup, disposal, the whole thing. You may, if it's a big enough project, you may need to stage those things out so that they occur in different years. Project development in the year prior. Project, doing the project in that year, along with shipping and permits and disposal, cleanup, all that kind of stuff. So yes, you should be reserving for all aspects of the project. They are qualified reserve expenses. Okay, our old reserve study makes no mention of warranties on roofs, even though none are older than 16 years. Okay, our shingles are Tamco Heritage, I remember this, with a 30-year limited warranty and 15-year full start warranty. What is a full start warranty? Well, preparing for this recording, I Googled that and found out the following. At Tamco, our asphalt shingle limited warranty includes full start non-prorated warranty periods, which offer an upfront period of protection as defined in the limited warranty by providing replacement of the affected shingles and labor costs to install them. Tear-off, removal, and disposal of the original shingles and the cost of accessory products is not included. After the full start period, the asphalt shingle limited warranty provides a prorated replacement of the affected shingles. Labor and cost and accessory products are not included. Okay, that's the end of what they say on their website. So in other words, I don't know. Discuss with your attorney and your reserve study professional and maybe Tamco to figure out what all that means and if it means anything. Basically, don't trust the warranty. Warranties are difficult to get money from, and good luck with that. Okay, the only mention of, another one. The only mention of warranty in the entire reserve study is regarding the siding, the hardy board. That's generally good material. I realize that having a manufacturer warranty is not very helpful if the manufacturer did not approve the installer and vice versa. In your opinion, what can a HOA do to maximize the possibility of getting warranty coverage, not just on our hardy shingles, but on all reserve components where you've seen warranties. Same kind of answer. I recommend not relying on warranties for the reasons you recommended. Material, installer, maintenance, all those kinds of things. Have your asset maintained well, have it inspected regularly, update your reserve study regularly, and that will help you prepare for its eventual replacement. Warranties are notoriously difficult to collect on. Our reserve study shows the current cost of components totaling $1.7 million. Of this, 76% is due to one component, our siding. I wonder if this is the same place with hardy siding. If confidence in the anticipated lifespan or future replacement costs of the siding is off by a small amount, it has a large effect on the recommended reserve contributions. Correct. Does a reserve specialist entire community have a way of including a confidence measure so HOAs don't suffer trying to get closer to a fully funded balance only to discover later that they put too much faith in a rough guess about lifespan and cost of one item? Well, the good thing is, let's talk about siding. Siding can have a 20, 30, or 40-year life expectancy. So when we start out now, we're not closing our eyes and then waiting 40 years. We are observing it every third year all through the process. So no one's being surprised 40 years into the future. And there's mathematical formulas built in. Just as this person asks, trying to be fully funded, that maximizes the strength of your reserve fund. You could also set a minimum threshold below which you would never want your reserve cash or reserve percent funded to fall. And there's also another unofficial guideline that in any year, you never want to end the year with less than 10% of the expenditures from that year. So if you're going to spend $100,000 in one year, you always want at least 10% or 10 grand left in cash. So there's lots of these different mathematical factors that your reserve study provider will use in trying to make sure you are truly well prepared and that that long life significant project is handled effectively. Quite commonly it's asphalt at a large plan development. They have a singular expense and it's asphalt. That's why you update things regularly to get as much advance notice as possible about something that might be aging a little faster than you expect or a little slower than you expect. You don't want to be surprised. Okay, I realize the typical reserve study relies on some sort of national database of expected lifespans and replacement costs. If the HOA was able to show records of previous maintenance, repair, and replacement projects with good detail about the scope of work, would the reserve specialist be able to adjust the national figure to consider local data on lifespan and cost? The answer is absolutely. We believe in local information more than national information. And the most local you can get is expenses for your actual association, your historical record. Have a file of reserve projects on your association. Update it every time you do a reserve project. And so it's there, it's part of the record. That way, we as a reserve study provider will know who did the roof project, when, at what cost, with what type of material, all those kinds of things. That's all great. We call it gold, actually, to have that kind of information. So that takes priority over national numbers. And at Association Reserves, we actually, due to the volume of clients that we have, we're able to use local actual costs from our clients, a neighboring client likely to yours, as we project future costs. So we actually, at Association Reserves, reference national cost databases only very rarely. Excuse me. And that brings me to the end of the list of component questions. I welcome you to join us for the other topics. We have other bonus content webinars that we have for general questions, funding plan, insurance and investment, inflation, legislation, and miscellaneous. Again, all designed for you to have success planning at your association. There will be common themes. Ask your reserve study professional. Ask your attorney. Ask your expert. Too complicated to answer in a free webinar. So yes, we're here to help. We're here to help any way we can with these free resources or guiding you towards where you need to go to. Thank you for joining me. Best wishes to you, and let us know how we can help.